Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, and I want to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities ecosystem, regardless of whether you're from a data center operator like a hyperscale, co-location, edge, modular, wholesale data center provider, or maybe you're part of a data center technology or data center facilities related company, or perhaps you do something related to construction or real estate or investment in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Or maybe your company is all in on some kind of outsourced sales and marketing services, outsourced sales and marketing solutions that work with data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. And it doesn't matter which role you sit on within the go-to-market team. If you work in sales, like as an account executive, AE, a sales development rep, a business development rep, like an SDR or a BDR, or maybe you're on the marketing team, or an account manager, or client success, or product or channel partnerships, or perhaps you are the leader, the executive sponsor that's responsible for recruiting, retention, getting the right people, sitting in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing their musical instruments at the right time, at the right tempo, at the right volume, orchestrating and making all of this wonderful growth happen in this very exciting period that we are in within the data center ecosystem. If this is the first time that you're joining us for the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, welcome. You're in for a real treat. If you've been here before, welcome back. We're thrilled to see you here again. If you want to make sure that you stay in the loop on upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure that you're subscribed to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter. You can sign up right on our website at www.dcsmi.com. This way you'll get notified in your email inbox on Sundays about new educational events just like this. So what is on the agenda for this week? First, we're going to start by talking about how a multi-tenant data center operator can generate qualified leads. Then we'll turn our attention to how to grow a data center consulting and engineering firm. Next, we'll look at how a data center telecommunications and technology company defines its primary focus. After that, we'll turn our attention to a quick break for a message from our sponsor, and then we'll dive into how a data center simulation and engineering firm can engage with the right decision makers. Next, we'll turn our attention, we'll talk about how a data center electrical and connectivity solutions provider can win new data center projects. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk all about how a data center energy efficiency consultancy can generate new leads and new clients. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you and your team are struggling with that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you are watching. So without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question. First up, how does a multi-tenant data center operator generate qualified leads? How does a multi-tenant data center operator generate qualified leads? That's a great question. And usually when we're talking about multi-tenant, we're talking about a co-location data center operator, which means multi-tenant means they have a facility and there's many different tenants, sometimes a few, sometimes a lot, depends on how big your minimums are, how big your average deal size is. But suffice it to say, there are more than one company, there's more than one company, perhaps more than 10 companies, perhaps more than 100 companies that have located one or more of their servers, one or more racks, one or more cabinets within your data center facility. So how do you generate qualified leads for that? What it largely comes down to is we need to know where you can win best. Where are you able to attract and engage and close the best clients, and where do the best clients tend to come from that stay with you the longest, that are the happiest, that expand their relationship with your company? If you have multiple facilities, they're itching to get their IT equipment, to get their servers in other facilities of yours as well. They love singing your praises to others within their company, with others within their industry. Overall, they're a delight to work with. They're profitable, and you'd love to just copy and paste and clone those clients to fill up your entire facility or multiple facilities. What do we know about those particular clients and what makes them qualified? Well, we want to define your ideal client profile, your ICP. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to figure out where you've been most successful in the past. Usually for most multi-tenant data center operators, most co-location operators, we can look at your website and we can see logos of some of the tenants that are in your multi-tenant data center facility. Sometimes we can see reviews and testimonials. Sometimes we can see case studies. And if all else fails and all of that information is locked down like Fort Knox under non-disclosure agreements, at the absolute minimum, you can go into your CRM, your customer relationship management system, and you can work with your finance director to go into your accounting or your ERP or whatever you use to track revenue. And between your CRM and your financial systems, you should be able to figure out who are the most successful clients based on Net Promoter Score, who spends the most with your company, who's the most profitable, who's been with you the longest. There's 4 or 5 different kinds of health indicators that you can see internally, even if there's nothing on your website that gives away your case studies, your logos, your testimonials. So what we're looking for in essence is once you figure out like that top 10 list or top 20 list, in other words, where like 80% of your revenue comes from, where 80% of your profit comes from, generally someone at the most senior levels, your executive team, should validate that these are the kinds of clients that you want going forward. And if so, that's essentially what you're going to use to build your ideal client profile. We're looking to figure out among these companies, what do they have in common? Where do they tend to be located? Are they all within a relatively quick drive of your data center facility? I was chatting with someone who was on my podcast last year about proximity of clients to co-location facilities. And he was recounting how the owner of a data center facility, this was in London, but I'm sure this will hold up in many other major data center markets throughout the globe, 2 miles, 2 kilometers, something like that close, where the CTO wants the data center facility to be to presumably where they live or where they work. Extreme proximity so they can come in and hug their servers. Server hugging's been around, nothing new. It's been around for 10, 15, 20 years. But yeah. So when it comes to your best clients, where do they tend to be located? Are they all within the same city or location or town or village of where you're located, municipality? Are they all within the same metro area? Are they all within the state, province, country, continent? What's interesting is for a lot of data center operators, you end up with like this hyper local sales and marketing go-to-market playbook that's targeted specifically at, I guess you'd call the server huggers, right? The people that are located in extremely close proximity to your facility. They're certainly within a 30 or 60-minute drive. And a lot of that playbook centers around getting those folks to come into your facility, hopefully on a fairly regular basis, to learn from your subject matter experts. And as a byproduct of those IT executives, those potential clients, perhaps those existing clients of yours, learning from your internal subject matter experts, their participation in their professional development, their learning and development with your company creates a tremendous amount of trust. You're educating and you're building trust. And when you do this well, you tend to find that the first person comes to one of your events and presumably you're in this to win and you want to repeat these kinds of educational events with some kind of regular cadence. I'd recommend at the absolute minimum quarterly, ideally monthly. And when you do this well, you'll likely have a different series for each of your prioritized buyer personas. Let's say you sell to IT executives, and then you also sell to channel partners like managed service providers. So maybe the first week of the month, you host a breakfast seminar for IT executives. And the third Wednesday of the month, you host a lunch and learn for integrators and consultancies and managed service providers, essentially channel partners, because you're going to talk about different topics with each of them. Now, if you've done this the right way with your real estate planning, hopefully there's a nice conference room or classroom in each of your facilities that comfortably sits 15, 20 people. If not, maybe your foyer can be retrofitted to serve that kinds of purpose for an hour or two twice a month. But essentially the idea is you've, within your target account list, within your ideal client profile, and again, your client profile defined geographically, this is the hyperlocal version. You're probably also going to want to layer a company size parameter, how big or how small these companies are, right? You know, if they're too small, maybe they can't afford your minimums. If they're so large, they may have such ridiculously complicated requirements that your co-location company may not be a fit for them. So maybe you settle on that you're looking for IT executives who are from companies with anywhere from 50 employees up to 5,000 employees, or 50 employees up to 1,000 employees. And that alone, the geographic, the job title, and the company size will allow you to start building out your target account list, your prioritized companies that you want to get the foot in the door with. And you may also discover, as a multi-tenant data center operator, depending on the region of the world where you're located in, there are certain accreditations, compliance, certifications that you either have or you don't have. And by the nature of where you're located and by the nature of their industry, their vertical, you're either shortlisted or immediately discounted, immediately disqualified. So with that in mind, you may also, in your ideal client profile, want to list specific industries that you want to target and specific industries that you want to exclude, because that will make building out your target account list and everything that you do with lead generation and nurturing and educating, building trust a lot more precise. So we know at the company level who we're looking to have come in for these events. Now, who are the people within these companies that we care most about? So when we go from the company or the account level targeting to the individual kinds of people within these companies, we're going to start talking about buyer personas. A buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an ideal client based on actual research and some select educated speculation. The actual research is non-negotiable. You actually need to have conversations with, or do surveys, or at the absolute minimum, study their search and social footprint to figure out among 10, 20, 30 people in that segment what their biggest goals are and what their biggest struggles are in their own words. And when you figure out the consensus for what their biggest goals and challenges are for, say, the IT executive, and you know perhaps that there's 5 or 6 different goals that they're working on individually, that their team is working on, that their company is on, that's directly related to like IT infrastructure, digital infrastructure, something that would lead them to look to eventually lease some space in a multi-tenant data center facility. If you know there's, say, 5 or 6 goals and there's 5 or 6 struggles, and you've gotten those 5 or 6 goals in their own actual words, not what you think the words are, but what the words actually are, because you did the homework and did the research. And in addition to those 5 or 6 goals, there's 5 or 6 struggles. Well, now you have 10 or 12 topics. And those 10 or 12 topics are what you'd want to put in your event calendar for your 10 or 12 monthly events. Symposias, breakfast seminars, lunch and learns. That's where to start. And with a lot of those goals and with a lot of those challenges, when you start talking to your internal subject matter experts about this, hopefully you have a fair amount of expertise internally and a decent amount of executive support. So you can say, oh, they're interested in cybersecurity, they're interested in latency, they're interested in AI, they're interested in high performance computing, whatever it is. So you end up with 5 or 10 topics in their own words. That's the title for each of your event. And with any luck, you actually have an internal subject matter expert who can prepare a 30 or 40 minute talk that's as good as any breakout session that someone would go to at a conference on that topic. And that's essentially your content for your breakfast seminar or your lunch and learn. If there's topics that come up that are of high interest among these goals and challenges with your primary and secondary buyer persona, and you don't have an internal subject matter expert, then look to your clients, look to your channel partners, look to your consultants, and see if you can bring in a guest speaker. And again, that's your content. That's your 30 or 40 minutes of core content for that event. And before the core content kicks off, you have a little lunch or breakfast or whatever you're anchoring this to, a little bit of time for some networking for the 10, 15, 20, 30 people. By the way, you don't need large numbers of people attending for this to be wildly successful. If the people that are attending align perfectly with your target account list, because why would you invite them if they don't? What you're going to discover over time is when they have a great experience learning at these events, the next time around, sometimes even the first time around, they start to be really receptive to bringing their coworkers with them, sometimes even their boss. So essentially what you're doing is you're getting in early and often, and you're using this education as a way to build consensus early enough in the middle stages of the buyer's journey, in the formative stages where you have a chance to dramatically shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are in front of them. So it's a near perfect match on your ideal client profile, on people on your target account list, segment by segment. And if you're just starting out, maybe you want everyone to be in the same series. But if it's very obvious when we look at your website that there's a direct play, like, again, you sell to IT executives and you also sell to channel partners, I'd recommend segmenting that out. There's completely different goals and completely different challenges and completely different language that each of those segments would care about and be motivated for attending this kind of event and a series of these kinds of events over time. Now, this is, again, in person. So you have a little bit of coffee and some lunch, breakfast, whatever it is before the event. They have the 30 or 40 minutes. You open it up for Q&A for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and then you take everyone on a tour. That's how you're getting 10, 15, 20 people every month, maybe twice a month, maybe every week, coming into your facility, learning with your team members, educating and building trust, being highly motivated to bring their coworkers with them. So you're meeting the rest of the decision committee, right? And they're touring your facility. And, don't make this an overt sales push, but more than likely the obvious person to be concierging, moderating these kinds of talks are your marketing and sales leaders. So they'll get to know everyone that's in the room. They'll get to know what they're paying attention to, what resonated, what kinds of questions they asked, and really, really deepening these relationships. Now, what about the people that can't attend? Well, you record the event. And for people that really can't attend, this is the other part of the playbook, the long distance part of the playbook for a multi-tenant data center operators. You could pretty much take the exact same slides, the exact same kind of content, and instead of delivering it in a classroom or conference room in your facility, you deliver it in a webinar or in a live stream. And again, record and repurpose. Because for every person that attends, there's probably anywhere from 10 to 100, maybe hundreds of people just like that, perhaps many from the same company that should have been there but weren't. That's the playbook that I would use for a multi-tenant data center operator to generate qualified leads that are primed to be highly motivated to want to spend a lot of time with your internal and external subject matter experts in a way that self-generates fantastic pipeline for your future tenants, for your multi-tenant data center operator facility. Okay, what do we have up next? Oh, by the way, if you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure to help spread the word, share the love by hitting the like button. Okay, so let's jump into our next question. What do we got? How do we grow a data center consulting and engineering firm? How do we grow a professional services firm that specializes in data center consulting and engineering? That is a fantastic question. So typically a company that specializes in engineering and consulting that goes along with engineering is within the facilities segment of the data center ecosystem. A company specializing in engineering and consulting related to that engineering, they're not a data center operator, They're not part of a data center technology company. Data center technology companies can also have specialized consultants, but they consult on things related to data center technology. Like a data center technology consultancy would advise on things like networking, connectivity, racks, cabinets, software, hardware, storage, cybersecurity. A data center engineering firm gets involved with things like commissioning, decommissioning, electrical, plumbing, mechanical, power, cooling, host of topics, really sustainability. So how do we grow? And they're certainly not in the engineering firm is not operating within construction, real estate, and investment, although they may get some good referrals from that part of the ecosystem. And they're not in the outsourced sales and marketing segment of the data center ecosystem. So again, a data center consulting and engineering firm operating within the facilities part of the data center ecosystem. So their first cousins would be like commissioning and decommissioning companies, power and cooling companies, physical security, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. So to grow that kind of engineering firm, we need to get crystal clear on your business model. And this is where, depending on how big or small your company is, where you're located, and the unique talents of your principals, the unique talents of your internal subject matter experts, you may have a different target market than other consulting and engineering firms in and around the data center ecosystem. But what we're essentially looking for is where you have done best in the past. So we'll look to like your case studies and your testimonials and your happiest, most profitable, lucrative clients that you can look up in your CRM, your customer relationship management, or your financial accounting to figure out what kinds of clients you want more of. And when you have that dialed in, then it becomes easier to figure out the ideal client profile, how big or how small these companies are. In other words, how big do they need to be essentially to afford your minimum level of engagement for your consulting and engineering firm? Typically, mid-size and large consulting and engineering firms have minimums that are such that it's just cost prohibitive for like a single location co-location operator or a single location mid-size company with their own data center to afford your minimums. But again, this will vary by your firm. You for sure should know what your minimum level of engagement is and how that aligns with how big that company needs to be typically to afford that. And at the other extreme, how large of a client can you be successful with your consulting and engineering firm? Can you realistically, with your current capabilities, provide consulting and engineering for Fortune 500 or Fortune 50 companies? Or is there a steep drop off in the success of your marketing, sales, service, and delivery capabilities at a certain point? So for a small to mid-sized consulting and engineering firm, maybe the floor is the company needs to have at least 50 employees, but less than 5,000 or less than 1,000. Again, it's going to vary based on where you've been most successful, but understanding where they're located, which typically aligns reasonably well with where you have staff, where you have principals, where you have consultants who can successfully go to that facility. If you're comfortable traveling globally and what you have is so incredibly specialized that your clients are okay with the fact that you need a significant amount of travel to get to their facilities, then you may have a global addressable market. You may be able to serve any country or continent on the planet. If there's more competition, if there's less differentiation, if you've found that typically what works best for your company is within a certain country or group of countries, again, that gets indicated in your ideal client profile, your ICP. So we've narrowed down geographically, we've narrowed down the company sizes, and maybe there's certain industries where you do better than others. Maybe you've had a lot of success working with telecommunications companies and manufacturing companies and healthcare companies. Maybe you've had very little success with financial services companies, so you want to exclude those. Maybe you've had very little success with government, so you want to exclude those. So your ideal client profile isn't just about the industries where you've done well. It may be about specifically excluding the industries where you have not done well, where you don't want that kind of business going forward. And when you have that documented, that helps to give a lot of clarity about building out your target account list, your couple dozen or couple hundred potential companies that could be a really good fit for you. It gives you a lot of clarity about content for your website copywriting. It provides a lot of clarity for what to do with your website navigation, what kinds of dedicated pages you may want to build out. Like, for example, we mentioned here that you've done well with telecommunications companies. You've done well with manufacturing companies. Like for healthcare companies, maybe each of those gets their own page and gets a little bit of real estate on your homepage, and each gets their own lead generation offer and perhaps their own email nurturing segment and perhaps their own educational events program, whether they're virtual events or in-person events. But either way, we're starting to narrow down like what's a really good fit. And once we know, let's say, for example, you have those 3 different segments and you've defined where the companies are located and how big or how small those manufacturing, healthcare, and telecommunications companies are, then we potentially may have 3 different buyer personas for the IT leader or the engineering leader. It's probably an engineering leader, right? Or it could be an executive, depending on how big or small these companies are. Like for a telecommunications company, who's your main point of contact typically for this kind of engagement? For a manufacturing company, ask yourself the same question. For a healthcare company, ask yourself the same question, and then figure out of those 3 segments, which is the most profitable. So you can stack rank those and designate one as your primary buyer persona. The second most profitable one is your secondary buyer persona. The third most profitable segment for selling, consulting, and engineering, that would be your tertiary buyer persona. And then with each of those segments, figure out the primary person's biggest goals and challenges in their own words, and then use that to build your copywriting, to build your sales enablement, your email, your social, your event strategy. And I'm very partial to using an events-focused approach to generating and nurturing these leads and advancing these leads into sales opportunities. These educational events should focus on what is top of mind for each of those segments in their own words. So if you figure out, for example, that telecommunications is top of the list, and you're dealing with a VP of engineering or a COO or whoever it is, then we need to understand what's going on in their world. For that person, what are their 5 or 6 biggest professional goals that they're actively working on right now? And what are their 5 or 6 biggest frustrations that they're struggling with right now? And for each of those, we need to know those in their own words. So once we have, say, for argument's sake, a handful of their biggest goals and a handful of their biggest challenges, we have 10 or 12 topics. And each of those 10 or 12 topics gets covered as a separate educational event, prioritized by which you hear most often. And you tackle each one of those as a separate webinar, a separate lunch and learn, a separate breakfast seminar. And again, you do not need large numbers of attendees to really move the needle on this. You could literally have 10, 20, 30 people attending that fit the perfect bullseye of your ideal client profile and your target account list. And you can make massive headway in educating and building trust, getting in early, getting in often, making the value proposition so high that your typical attendee is very, very strongly motivated to bring others from their team along with them. So you're providing this training and educating and building trust with multiple stakeholders from the same company. So over time, you're getting to meet the decision committee. You're getting in there early enough that you have a chance to impart your wisdom and best practices and dramatically shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are in front of them for data center consulting and data center engineering. And you're recognizing that this is not one and done. A typical data center related purchase decision, from stranger to purchase decision, 25 to 30 different touch points. So your goal is to be in there as many of those touch points as possible if you want to not only get on the short list, but stay on the short list. And when you do this really, really well, you'll find that your competitors start to drop off of the short list because they're learning so much from you. They're getting so much value from the time that they're spending with your client-facing team members that are subject matter experts on anything and everything having to do with data center consulting and engineering. So again, tackle the segment by segment, focus on providing value in a learning and development, professional development context. So the right people are highly motivated to want to spend time with your client-facing team members repeatedly over and over and over again. And when you do this really well, guess what? They have less time to spend. There's less time to spend with your competitors, right? Because they're learning so much from you and they may be so highly enamored with the value that you've provided throughout these educational events throughout a period of several weeks or several months, that when it finally comes to the time where they're ready for a sales related conversation, you may discover that the shortlist doesn't exist anymore. Your company is the shortlist. In other words, your educational events and the affinity and the trust and the multiple stakeholders from that company coming along with their peers essentially to learn with you in that group setting, you're driving alignment, you're driving collaboration. Largely what account executives need to do in enterprise settings anyway, where a big part of their successful selling motion is empowering the internal champion to drive alignment across the internal champion's team and other teams of stakeholders within the company. So when you're in there early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context, so you and your client-facing team members are seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center consulting and engineering, truly magical things can happen with growing your pipeline, with getting you the ideal clients that are a fantastic fit for growing your firm. So that's how to grow a data center consulting and engineering firm. What do we have up next? Our next question for today is, so our next question deals specifically with the data center technology segment within the data center ecosystem. The question is, how can a data center telecommunications and technology company define its primary focus? How does a data center telecommunications and technology company define its primary focus? So just to orient ourselves within the 5 segments of the data center ecosystem, your company may be involved in data center operations by virtue of the fact that you're describing yourself as a data center company. You have financial interests in technology and telecommunications specifically. So part of your business model is heavily anchored in the technology segment within the data center ecosystem. You don't have much going on within data center facilities. Your facility exists as a byproduct of construction, real estate, and investors, but that's not your primary business model, and it's not outsourced sales and marketing. So a company that is principally in the business of data centers, telecommunications, and technology is likely heavily anchored to the technology space within data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructures, and may also have some business model interest in being a data center operator. So defining your primary focus, that's a great question, because with these 3 different lines of business, you need to look at which is most profitable, which is most strategic. And that's usually not just a sales and marketing strategy question. That's a CEO kind of question, chief product officer, chief financial officer, board of directors kinds of question for defining your primary focus. Because it is quite common to find companies that are operators that also have financial interests in telecommunications and also provide a variety of IT services, technology services. Actually, the first and the third, the data center operator that sells a lot of managed services, almost as if they're a managed service provider, is quite common. And the telecommunications usually comes through acquisition, or at the absolute minimum, through a number of strategic relationships with telecommunications carriers that come into your facility through your meet me room, right? Through the carrier neutrality, through having potentially multiple handfuls or perhaps several dozen different telecommunication choices coming into your facilities, being fantastic for your data center clients. But when it comes to defining your primary focus, you really need to figure out which of these segments you'd potentially lead with. Are you looking for clients where out of the gate they're going to be a fit for all 3 of these areas? Or are you okay if they put servers or cabinet rack or something in your facility and they don't buy any services from you, or there's no revenue coming in on the telecommunications, you're just doing this as a pass-through and a convenience, because they're going to come in both bringing their own telecom in either through dark fiber or their own services by bringing their own team, and they're potentially doing all this. So are you okay if they cherry pick just one part of these 3 segments? Or is it incredibly important that you find clients that actually need all three of those, because the cross subsidization, the marginal revenue, however you want to call it, is incredibly core to what you do in being able to provide this kind of turnkey solution. So in terms of defining your primary business model focus, to this day, there are data center colocation providers that are very real estate focused. And there are data center operators, colocation operators that are very IT services focused. And there's some that do a reasonably good job of balance between the two extremes. I mean, at the real estate scenario, there's some that feel like at times they're running like a co-working space for servers, except instead of people sitting in the rack 724, 365, their servers are sitting in the racks and just renting power and cooling and space and everything else related to remote hands and management, and everything's going to be provided by the client as opposed to your firm or channel partners that you work with to provide these kinds of services. So the strategic focus is something that's almost certainly going to be decided by, depending on your company size. If you're a co-location company with up to probably 500 or 1,000 employees, that is likely something that gets decided by your CTO and your CEO. If your company is significantly larger, then it's probably a team of people in a product kind of context, in a CTO kind of context, in an engineering kind of context that are figuring these out. Again, the smaller your company is, the more likely that your C-level executives are involved in these kinds of strategic focus, primary focus kinds of conversations. If your company is huge, it's probably the next level, the vice president level, that's getting involved in that. But again, before you worry about educating and building trust, before you worry about field marketing versus virtual marketing or digital marketing, before you worry about deciding how much of your investments go to big conferences versus hosting your own events that are micro-targeted on your buyer persona, all of that is secondary until you figure out what business you're actually in, right? The job to be done that you're doing for a specific kind of client. And that usually comes down to where you have a unique advantage, where you have strategic competitive advantages, where you can win where other companies in your space simply cannot. When you're in your magic zone, whatever you want to call this, of where you're happiest, where you're most profitable, and your clients enjoy similar kinds of unique benefits that they just simply can't get anywhere else. So at a high level, in a larger company, these kinds of focus ideas for data center facilities are usually decided by product executives, a chief product officer, a VP of products, something like that. In data center operators, I see that there's a debate about how these roles are sometimes blended together. At some data center operators, I've seen the chief marketing officer also be the chief product officer, because so much of communications and educating and building trust and positioning and sales enablement and product marketing and everything is joined at the hip with product strategy. So you see a CMO / CPO, chief marketing officer / chief product officer. I also see quite a few cases now where marketing and sustainability is getting joined at the hip, where the chief sustainability officer is also the chief marketing officer. A more classical, more traditional approach to this is you see a blending of the marketing / sales leader, the chief marketing officer / chief sales officer, or the vice president of sales and marketing, or the chief revenue officer, or something like that. But the product focus is usually a product roadmap decision. And once that's in place, typically based on a lot of research on what's going on from a competitive intelligence standpoint and SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and where you think you can win on a sustainable, profitable basis, then that's your primary focus. And that primary focus will help drive how data center specific, how telecommunications specific, how technology specific your product marketing and your sales enablement tends to be. Regardless of what your product focus is, however, I would encourage you to think about what your education and trust building is going to do earlier on in the journey, before the specific kind of person that you're looking to attract even knows that they're looking for a data center company or a telecommunications company or a technology company. What do I mean by that is we need to understand what's the for your primary and your secondary and your tertiary buyer personas, for your 2 or 3 most important segments, what is the leading indicator? What's the goal that shows up? What's the challenge that shows up weeks, maybe even months before they're ready for a sales related conversation? Because the earlier you can get in and the more often you can get in at educating and building trust, that's the new competitive battleground. That's the new differentiation. Some companies are doing great at this. A lot of data center operators have been doing fantastic at content marketing and thought leadership for 10 years or more. There's some companies that are kicking and screaming, resisting this, thinking that their clients are different and our clients would never look for this information on LinkedIn or watch a YouTube video or attend a webinar or watch a podcast. And that's an interesting conversation when it comes up, because I'm on the young side of Gen X. I still spend quite a bit of time on a monthly basis with the baby boomers that are still actively working in this industry. At this stage, quite a few are now more in consulting, part-time kind of advisory roles, but there's still a significant amount that are working full-time. And among the people that I know that are a half a generation more advanced in their careers than I am, I don't know anyone who's still actively working in this space that isn't on LinkedIn all day long. I don't know anyone in that segment that doesn't attend webinars and frequently speak at webinars. I don't know anyone in that segment that isn't constantly having microphones put in front of them to speak at events, to speak on podcasts. Some of them host their own podcasts. So when people tell me that their clients are different and they would never learn from their peers on LinkedIn, and they would never learn from YouTube videos, and they would never attend or speak at webinars or podcasts, I don't know who the heck they're talking about. Because we've now reached a tipping point where even among the massive amounts of digital transformation that have pushed the point of vendor contact from 56% to 83% over the last 10 years, putting a lot more millennials and Gen Z into decision-making roles, we're now to the point where all of this digital transformation has hit like 95% plus across nearly all of the segments of the data center ecosystem, across nearly all of the job functions that are likely to be sitting on these decision-making committees. So before you pull these random limiting beliefs out of thin air that relegate your go-to-market strategy to the days of fax modems and BlackBerries, I would encourage you to actually talk to your actual buyer personas, do the actual research, and figure out how they're influenced, how they learn, what their resources are, what their watering holes are, and make sure that you're competitive with what their actual expectations are for the self-driven journey. We're like 85% of research and decision-making now happens without you in the room. And the only way you're getting back in to the room and earning a seat on their side of the table is to be invited in as a teacher, a consultant, and a trusted advisor. They don't want to spend much time with salespeople anymore. They don't want to spend time with vendors anymore. However, until they're almost ready to buy. However, you can bypass that and still earn your way in if they see your account executives and your sales development reps and your product specialists, your channel partner experts as teachers, as consultants, as subject matter experts, as trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders. So when it comes to defining your primary focus, it should, for the most part, be about understanding who your ideal clients are, understanding who the most important stakeholders are, and the primary focus should be getting in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, early enough where you're able to make a significant impact on how they navigate the choices in front of them. And for heaven's sake, in the right context, so that you can get out of the vendor box, so they don't see your team members as focused on the transaction, so they understand the true business problem solving value that you deliver to your prospects and clients. Because in data centers and telecommunications and technology, for sure, there's significant amounts of those segments that are really, really commoditized, mature businesses at this point. So one of the most important things that you can do, even if you're investing in a ton of innovation and research and development, is making sure that your ideal clients, your prioritized buyer personas, know not only about your competitive advantages from a product and services standpoint, but are able to experience experience that competitive advantage and that differentiation throughout the full buyer's journey. So you're educating and building trust and shaping the criteria at a time where you still have an opportunity to shape the criteria and impact ultimately the company that they're going to choose to work with. If you don't show up, you're invisible. And what that means is they're going to learn from someone else. In most cases, that means they're learning from your competitor. Do you want your prospects and clients to be learning from your team members, or do you want them to be learning from your competitors? This is a strategic company culture issue that for many kinds of companies that are involved in data center telecommunications and technology, this is for many companies needs to start at your CEO level. It start at your C-suite because these are big, big culture changes. But in the world we now live in, where 83% of that buyer's journey, direct from Gartner, is all the researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens before sales contact, before vendor contact. This is the new competitive battleground. Do you want to compete to win, or do you want to bury your head in the sand and pretend like it's still 10 or 20 years ago? The choice is ultimately yours. So that's how I would approach how a data center telecommunications and technology company can define, execute, and maintain its primary focus over time. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. When we come back, we'll tackle 3 more of the biggest sales and marketing challenges throughout the data center ecosystem. If you're getting great value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the word, help share the love by hitting the like button wherever you're watching.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We're all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry, and you're tuned into our weekly Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week we tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. If you have an idea for a question, a topic, or a challenge that you or your team or your company are facing when it comes to data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're enjoying this show. So what do we have up next? Our next question for this week that we're going to tackle is within the data center facilities side. And in particular, we're going to talk about how a data center simulation and engineering firm can engage with the right decision makers. How can a data center simulation and engineering firm engage with the right decision makers? So just to frame where we are within the ecosystem, again, a data center simulation and engineering firm, you're not a data center operator, you're not a data center technology company. There's actually some data center technology related companies that provide digital twins, 3D modeling, simulation, usually related to networking, sometimes related to telecommunications. So there are simulation related companies that operate in the data center technology part of the segment, but in this particular case where we're talking about engineering, the simulation usually has to do more with engineering related issues, which for today's marketplace probably has a heck of a lot to do with power and cooling. So you're operating within the facilities segment of the data center ecosystem. You're not in construction, real estate, or investment, although you might get some referrals from investors and general contractors and MEP and EPC kinds of experts in those particular segments. So how does the simulation and engineering firm engage with the right decision makers? So what the right decision makers are for your firm may not necessarily be the right decision makers for your direct competitors or your indirect competitors. Just to level set with all of this, when it comes to a competitive analysis, your direct competitors would be the companies that your sales team tends to see coming up over and over and over again at the tail end part of the sales process. These are the companies where you're winning deals from, you're winning deals against, and you're losing deals to. Those are the ones you know about. Indirect competitors tend to be companies that you may not be paying quite as much attention to because they don't seem as geographically relevant to where you're located. In other words, maybe your presence is in EMEA, and this particular company only has physical presence in the United States or Asia Pacific or something like that. So you may be disregarding them, not prioritizing them as that much of a serious competitive threat because of geographic differences. You may also be disregarding them because their company size is very different than yours. In other words, if you're a relatively small simulation and engineering firm, maybe you have 30 or 40 employees, you may recognize that the kind of client that wants an engineering firm with thousands or tens of thousands of employees, it's a completely different context. So in many cases, the indirect competitors, one party sees the other as a competitor, but it's not a mutual worry. In other words, like a smaller engineering firm may be worried about losing deals to a much larger engineering firm, but the confidence and the bravado of the huge enterprise consulting firm with thousands of employees, they're probably not losing sleep over losing deals to a solo engineering consultant or a consultancy with 5 or 10 employees or something like that. So it's not a mutual worry. You're not mutually considered to be indirect competitors with each other. So that's the difference largely between direct and indirect. What a lot of people are completely overlooking, though, is this third category, what I call non-business model competitors. What's a non-business model competitor? A non-business model competitor is a company that produces incredibly valuable educational resources and educational events on topics that are incredibly important to your prioritized buyer personas, but they're not in the business of being a data center simulation and engineering firm. So a lot of people say, like, so why would I care about this? The reason to care about this is we now live in a world where most of your prospects and clients don't want to talk with you and don't want to talk with your sales team until they're almost ready to buy. This is very different than as recently as 10 years ago. If I was talking with you about this 10 years ago, you would have found that a typical journey for data center related products and services like simulation and engineering, your prospects and your clients would get about halfway through their journey, and then they'd be open to scheduling some time with someone from your sales development team, your business development team, your sales team, whatever, however you're positioning this within your firm. At the time, 56% was the most commonly referred to number. And that was research that was done by CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner. At the time they did this research with Salesforce and SiriusDecisions. Add 10 years of digital transformation to that, and millions of baby boomers retiring, more Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people working from home at the beginning of the 2020s. And that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. And we actually think with the kind of clients we work with that that's even understated, that it's actually past that point already. So in other words, Gartner's latest research on this, 83% of a journey now happens without you in the room. Your prospects and clients will only be open to meeting with someone in a sales context when they've gotten to that, like, they're almost ready to buy. 83% of the journey is over already. So what that means is even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there for the final 17%. And wow, does this pose a lot of challenges to a company like yours that may still only be investing predominantly in very traditional marketing and sales kinds of campaigns, but it also is an enormous opportunity if you understand just how much the world has changed with buyer preferences, if you're able to get in early and often, if you're able to attract the right people in the right places at the right time early in the journey, enough for you to be able to educate and build trust. And so that your prospects and clients see your subject matter experts as the be all end all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center simulation and engineering for a company just like theirs in a specific geographic region of a certain size in a certain kind of industry, and for specific kinds of stakeholders on that decision committee. So once you have that mindset, it becomes a lot easier to pick your battles and to know where you can win with the right decision makers, because then we dial in our ideal client profile really, really tight. So we know where these clients are located, how big or small these companies are, and what industries you tend to do best within. and what industries that are not a good fit for you because you've worked with them in the past and you want nothing to do with them going forward. So that's defining your ideal client at the company level. And getting that right allows you to build out a target account list of anywhere from a couple dozen, usually a couple hundred, in some cases a few thousand potential clients that you could work with. Now, that's at the company level, at the account level. What about the individual people in these companies that you're going to want to create awareness among, that you want to educate and build trust with? The individuals within the companies, those are your buyer personas. A buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an ideal client based on actual research and some select educated speculation. The actual research is incredibly important. Just because a couple people in your company have been in data center simulation and engineering for decades doesn't necessarily mean that they have all of the answers on what's going on inside the mind of your prioritized buyer personas. They can have some valuable input. Maybe it's 20, 25% of the input, but 75, 80% of the input should come from doing actual research with your prioritized buyer personas. So let's say in a typical data center company you're selling to, maybe it's a chief engineering officer, vice president of engineering, something like that. Among that particular stakeholder, what are their biggest goals and what are their biggest challenges, and how do they articulate those in their own words? Once you find the consensus on their biggest goals that they're working on professionally, either individually, among their team, their direct reports, or at a company level, and you know the consensus on that, maybe there's 5 or 6 big goals they're currently working on. Maybe there's 5 or 6 big challenges that they're currently struggling with. So you end up maybe with 5 or 6 goals, 5 or 6 challenges. You have 10 or 12 topics here that are top of mind among that decision maker. And then you repeat the exact same exercise for the exact same research for your second most important segment. So maybe your second most important segment is someone that would be a referral partner, who's a referral partner for a data center simulation and engineering firm. Maybe it's an architect, data center design firm. Maybe it's site planners. Maybe it's a general contractor. This is going to vary depending on your business model and how big or small your company is. But almost certainly, there's more than one category of stakeholder that you would interact with on a regular basis when it comes to anything and everything related to data center simulation and engineering. So we need to know for that particular person, what do they care about? What's going on in their world? What are their biggest goals? Their 5 or 10, 5, 6 biggest goals in their own words. What are they struggling with the most in their own words? Their 5 or 6 biggest challenges. And we're going to use that as a map for what we want to talk about on our website, what we want to talk about in our sales enablement, what we want to talk about in our lead generation offers, and what we want to talk about with our events. And it doesn't matter whether these are online events like webinars and live streams, podcasts, or offline events like breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, conference breakout sessions, whatever it is. What we're largely want to focus on doing for engaging with the right decision makers is educating and building trust on topics that are top of mind for them, that they know are top of mind because you asked 10, 20, 30 people and you got the consensus on what's top of mind for those specific decision makers. So instead of showing up as a vendor, we want to be able to show up more like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, and a trusted advisor that aligns with those 5 or 10 biggest goals and challenges that they told you about. Once you have that research, then you're going to go to your internal subject matter experts and figure out who knows a lot about that particular topic, who could talk for 30 or 40 minutes about that particular topic and put together a nice little deck that's conference grade content that if they flew across the country, flew across the world to listen to, and it was one of 10 or 12 sessions that they went to at the conference, you're highly confident that you would get a near perfect score, that everyone would love what you presented and provided amazing amounts of value. Because that's kind of the mindset that you should go through when it comes to hosting your own events, whether these events are in person or virtual or both. Because the idea is that by providing extreme value and extreme relevance, it's highly likely that the first person from one of these target companies signs up, and immediately following sign up, they get back a confirmation that says, "Hi, Susan, we're so glad that you signed up for data center simulation and engineering best practices for financial services companies. But when it comes to a company like yours, we know it takes a village. It's truly a team. This is a multidisciplinary kind of project. Typically, people are involved from engineering, infrastructure, operations, finance, construction. You list out the 5 or 6 stakeholders that typically weigh in, that show up on a decision committee. So with that in mind, who else would benefit from attending our upcoming webinar, our upcoming breakfast seminar, our upcoming lunch and learn, whatever it is? Simply hit the forward button on your email, add a thought or two, and let your colleagues know why they benefit from attending as well. And this simple email marketing automation that, frankly, in the world of AI may seem a little bit colloquial, is that the right word? A little bit old-fashioned. This is essentially email marketing automation that you've been able to do for 20 years. Yet I'm shocked how few companies actually take this simple step of asking who else should attend, who else should watch, who else should download, who else should subscribe. And you know what happens? It doesn't even need to happen that much of the time. Maybe it only happens 10 or 20% of the time. But you know what happens? All of a sudden, multiple people from the same company start attending your events. Their coworkers, their peers from their team, in some cases, their bosses, their peers from other teams. You start to see 2, 3, 4, 5 people from the same company registering for your events. And they start to learn together with your internal subject matter experts. You're educating and building trust. You're helping to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are in front of them for data center simulation and engineering. And the more value that you provide at these events, the more likely it is that when you hold part 2 and part 3, we talked about 10 or 12 topics over the next 10 or 12 months, right? It's more likely that you start to see, wow, the first time through, we had 2 people from this company. At part 2 and part 3, we're starting to see 5, 6, 7 people. And then one of them pulls you aside and says, this is amazing. We love attending your events. Hey, we have an offsite coming on next month where the entire company is going to be there. Would you like to come in and talk to our, we'd be like, well, that'd be awesome. I'd love to come in. That's how you meet the whole decision committee, slowly but surely, by winning them over with seeing that you have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to data center simulation and engineering. Now, if you have internal subject matter experts to pull this off, it's even easier. If you don't have internal subject matter experts for all 10 or 12 of these topics, but you can cover some of them, then just simply look to your clients that you can bring in and moderate panels with, or consultants that you work with, or channel partners that you work with. You're hosting the party. You're hosting the events that's educating and building trust. And at the end of the day, the more touch points that you can have with the ideal clients in this kind of professional development, learning and development context, the more they want to spend time with you, the less time they're spending with anyone else that could be a competitive alternative to you. So this is how you get on the short list. This is how you stay on the short list throughout the full journey. This is how competitors to yours start to drop off the short list. This is how you get clients that are not going to haggle with you. They're going to be a lot less price sensitive because you've taken the time in educating and building trust with them in their formative weeks, in their formative months, in their formative stages where there was a chance to shape, making sure that they're asking the right questions when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center simulation and engineering. So in addition to your ideal client profile, your target account list will focus on the right companies. Your personas will focus on using the right kind of topics, the right kind of messaging. And then when it comes to getting to the right decision makers, there's no magic single decision maker anymore. People are so risk averse. Even if you get the meeting through a warm introduction to the magic person, in nearly all scenarios, they're going to kick it back to their team, their direct reports, to go build consensus with them. So you're going to need to build this consensus anyway. Make sure that your model is set up to recognize that there's no single decision-making person anymore. It's in most cases a decision-making committee, and you're going to need to win over multiple stakeholders. And what better way to do this than by using educational events and educational resources that share unique insights that help these folks do their job better, that help them close the gaps on reaching their professional goals individually, as a team, as a company, and provide unique value to helping them to overcome some of their biggest challenges and frustrations when it comes to anything and everything related to data center simulation and engineering. So from a tactical perspective, educational events, outbound target account lists, potentially LinkedIn ads, and other kinds of campaigns and activities that allow you to get this event invitation in front of the right people. But if you have a good CRM, a good email database of knowing who the right people are, and it's just a matter of getting them to pay more attention to you, focus on being more interesting to them. Focus on delivering exceptionally strong value so that they see you and your team as an integral part of how their team learns and keeps up with changes that impact all of the topics, all of the subjects, all of the goals and challenges that are leading indicators that in the coming weeks or in the coming months, that they're going to be a perfect prospect, a perfect future client for your company's data center simulation and engineering services. Okay, what do we have up next? Our next question is, how does a data center electrical and connectivity solutions provider win new data center projects? How does a company that provides data center electrical and connectivity solutions win new data center projects? That's a fascinating question, because sometimes when we're dealing with these kinds of questions, it's very clear that you're only operating within one of the 5 sectors, one of the 5 segments within the data center ecosystem. But in the case of electrical and in the case of connectivity, the electrical part of this is going to be operating within the facilities part of the data center ecosystem, and connectivity is going to be operating within the technology part of the data center ecosystem. Over at DCSMI, we catalog 12 or 13 different kinds of data center facilities related companies and 22 different kinds of data center technology companies. So in this particular case, you're dealing with, on the electrical side, probably facilities managers, facilities directors, or something similar to that. And on the connectivity side, you're dealing with technology managers, technology kinds of executives. In a smaller, like single location data center operator, end user kind of environment, it may be that you have one person wearing multiple hats. But for sure, the electrical skill set and the connectivity skill set cross those 2 different sectors within the data center ecosystem. So how can you win more data center projects? So we need to understand historically where you've won in the past. What kinds of new projects do you want to win? Because for companies that provide electrical and low voltage cabling, there can be profitable projects, and then there can be projects that are so small and so low margin that you may prefer to let your competitors take those projects so you can actually build a business that's profitable and sustainable. So we need to get clear on what kinds of new data center projects that you actually want. Historically, where you've won and had success in the past. And usually for this kind of company that is providing both electrical and connectivity, it's quite common to find logos on your website for the kinds of companies that you've done these kinds of projects for in the past. Maybe there's case studies, maybe there's testimonials, reviews. At the absolute minimum, there's going to be information sitting in your CRM, your customer relationship management system, and your finance, your accounting system that gives you an idea of who your biggest clients are, who generates the most revenue, who's the most profitable, and what kinds of specific new data center projects you want. Because getting specific about that is the key for success, the key for efficiency, and the key to success. And by understanding what these kinds of clients have in common with these projects, we can sharpen up your ideal client profile. We'll know geographically where they're located, because of course, when it comes to electrical and connectivity, you need to have physical presence in that markets, or have partners, have vendors that have physical presence in those markets. It's very hard to sell electrical and connectivity services through you certainly can't deliver it through a webinar, right? You have to have physical going there and doing site security and having the permits and the installation, the techs and everything. So having physical presence in that geographic market is incredibly important. So that's going to shape the geographic part of how you define your ideal client profile. You will also, over time, when it comes to figuring out what kinds of projects you want more of, likely start to see trends in how big or how small these companies are. And the how big or how small defines the company size. In other words, how big does a company need to be to afford your minimums to be profitable? And at what point is the company so large that it overwhelms your current capabilities? And for a small to mid-size electrical and connectivity solutions provider, maybe you're ranges companies with anywhere from 50 employees up to 5,000 employees or something like that. Again, your mileage will vary depending on how big or small your company is, your resources, your capital, what region you're located in, where your clients are. But that's a quick back of napkin way of thinking about it. So there's a geographic component to defining this. There's a company size component, and then maybe there's some industries that are a better fit than others. When it comes to electrical and connectivity, you may not be subject to the same kinds of compliance and industry kind of scrutiny that a data center operator would be, but for sure, there's definitely some licensing things that come up. There will be some bonds and some integration work that may be unique to specific kinds of industries that you're better suited to work with than others, or maybe you're just better at selling and servicing certain segments and industries. And those would be on your preferred list. And then there'd be some that you want to avoid with the 10-foot pole because they end up being nightmare clients. So there's industry inclusions and industry exclusions that may be relevant to both of your lines of business, depending on whether you're talking about the electrical or the connectivity, the low voltage part of your business. Once you have that in place, you should be able to build out a target account list of companies that meet that criteria. And then within those companies, who are the most important stakeholders that sit on the decision committees about anything and everything that's related to electrical and connectivity. You also, from a business model positioning differentiation part of it, is, are you one company and one brand that sells both of these? And do all of your clients, by definition, need to be purchasing both electrical and connectivity, or are you happy to sell these a la carte? Because that, again, will factor big into what's a qualified lead versus what's not. But at the end of the day, there's still individual people that we need to create awareness among, that we need to educate and build trust with, and we need to know what they're trying to achieve professionally, individually, as a team, as a company, that's directly or indirectly related to making a decision to buy electrical connectivity, electrical services, connectivity kind of services, and most importantly, is a leading indicator that sometime in the next couple of weeks and sometime in the next couple of months that they're going to be in market for these kinds of services. The better job you can do at getting in early and often and educating and building trust and shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate the different options that are in front of them, the easier it is for you to get out of that vendor box and stay out of the vendor box. The vendor box is largely going to be where your competitors live, who suck at differentiation, who just are terrible at being able to get them out of being a commodity broker. And we want to get you out of the commodity broker business because for the most part, it's really difficult to build a profitable company if you look just like everyone else. If there's nothing unique about your service offering, if there's nothing unique about how you market, if there's nothing unique about how you sell, if there's nothing unique about how you sell and service. And one of the best ways to differentiate is to recognize that the self-driven buyer's journey is now a really big deal. 10 years ago, it was quite common for your prospects and clients to spend about half of their journey, half of your sales cycle with members of your sales team. However, that is now very much a nostalgic moment in the rearview mirror. No one spends half of the journey with sales teams anymore. In the self-driven journey, what you're far more likely to find is how Gartner best articulates this: 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens before vendor contact, before sales contact. 83%. So what that means is even if you do everything right for your data center, electrical, and data center connectivity company, you're only going to be in there for the final 17%. The only way we can get back to that bygone era where your client-facing team members have a relationship with prospects and clients is we need to transform them. We need to transform them so instead of being seen as AEs and SDRs and BDRs and similar kinds of titles, they're seen more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, and trusted advisors, so that your prospects and clients actually want to spend time with them. This changes the nature of how you hire. This changes the nature of the kind of professional development investments that you make in your team members with upskilling, cross-skilling, cross-training, how you organize your teams. Because at the end of the day, regardless of who the target buyer personas are for this kinds of business, it's far more likely that they'll spend a lot more time educating, allowing you to educate and build trust with them if they see your company and your client-facing team members as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center, electrical, and connectivity solutions. And this isn't a problem that just happened overnight, and it's not going to be something you're going to fix overnight. For the most companies, These are big cultural changes. And a lot of companies are very resistant to these changes because they're just resistant to change in general. Heck, you're in the data center industry. You know that one of the most difficult parts with transformation is the people part, getting people to change their beliefs. The reality, however, though, is when it comes to both the facilities executives and the electrical decision makers and the technology and the connectivity and the telecommunications decision makers, in nearly all cases, they're doing a lot more research on their own before they get to you in a self-driven journey. They're not spending much time with sales teams anymore. And the only way you're going to earn your way back in early and often is to look a lot more like professional development, to look a lot more like learning and development. And again, in order to be successful with this, you really need to get inside their heads and figure out what their biggest goals, what their biggest challenges are, and retool all of your event strategy to be about educating and building trust with these folks for the right reasons, for things that are actually top of mind for them. Not what you would like to be top of mind for them, but what actually is top of mind for them. And we know this because we did our homework, we did our research. And when this happens, they're far more likely to be interested in attending your educational events, your breakfast seminars, your lunch and learns, your symposias, your webinars. And they're also far more likely to bring their peers, to bring their coworkers along with them, maybe even their boss along with them. Teams that learn together, grow together. And most importantly, because you and your client-facing team members are the ones educating and building trust, you are in a very, very powerful position to be able to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options in front of them. If you totally opt out of this and are okay with living in a status quo back when fax modems and BlackBerries still mattered, probably a good 15, 20 years ago at this point. If you're okay betting your company on the future, just understand that your ideal clients are learning from someone. So the question is, do you want them to be learning from your team members, or do you want them to be learning from your competitors? The choice is yours. What's going to stack the decks in your favor? More than likely, having your ideal prospects, having your ideal clients learn from your internal and external client-facing team members. So at a high level, that's how I would approach how a data center electrical and connectivity solutions provider can win new data center projects. And that brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value from this week's episode, make sure that you hit the like button wherever you're watching. And if you have an idea for a topic, for a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching, and we will add it to the consideration queue. Okay, what's our final question for this week? How does a data center energy efficiency consultancy generate new leads and new clients? How does a data center energy efficiency consultancy generate new leads and new clients? So a company, a professional services company that's principally in the business of providing consulting around energy efficiency, operates within the data center facilities part of the data center ecosystem. It's not a technology company. They're not in construction. They're not in real estate. They're not an investment company, although they may get some really good referrals from construction kinds of companies. They're principally a company specializing in energy efficiency, works in the facilities part of the ecosystem. They may also get some great referrals from technology companies, but their ideal client in most cases that they're selling data center energy efficiency consulting to would be data center operators and data center end users. In other words, enterprises that have their own data centers. In some cases, these could be co-location operators. In some cases, these could be huge cloud providers like hyperscalers. Depends on where you're located, how expansive or how narrow your marketing and sales and go-to-market strategy is. But at the end of the day, most of your revenue is likely coming from clients that are either data center operators or have their own data centers. So in terms of generating new leads and new clients for an energy efficiency consultancy, we need to get really specific on the kinds of clients that you actually want. Where have you been most successful? What kind of clients have the most, that get the most value from your services? What kind of clients have been most profitable, most lucrative, and are most strategic to where you want to take your company next? And when you're able to answer those questions, you'll be able to dial in your ideal client profile. In other words, where are these clients tend to be located? Do you sell in one country? Do you sell in a group of countries? Do you sell to an entire continent? Do you sell globally? I know someone that specializes in data center decarbonization, which is a pretty close first cousin of data center energy efficiency consulting. And he travels all over the globe. So services are in demand globally, depending on how specialized you are and how strong your professional brand is and how strong your company's brand is. Remember, your brand is no longer today about just your colors and your logos and your fonts. Your brand is everything that the marketplace says about your company, says about your firm when you're not in the room. And given that in a self-driven buyer's journey, you're not in the room for much of the research and decision-making process anymore. It's going to be your content and events that do the heavy lifting, that get you back into the room to have the kind of power that you had as recently as 10 years ago, back when your prospects and clients still spent about half of their journey with people in a sales context. Those days are now long gone. Now you typically find 80 or 90% of the journey is over before you get to meet a prospect or client. So having strong, incredibly valuable educational resources and educational events are your ticket to getting back in early enough to be able to shape the criteria that prospects and clients use to decide ultimately where they're going to invest their resources in getting energy efficiency consulting. So when it comes to getting new leads and getting new clients, a lot of times there's information on your website that gives us an idea of where you've been most successful. Logos, case studies, testimonials, reviews. At the minimum, it's sitting in like your customer relationship management, your financial accounting software. Again, we need to figure out where they're located, how big or small their companies are, and there are certain industries that are a better fit than others. This ideal client definition will allow you to build out a target account list of anywhere from a couple dozen to usually a few hundred, in some cases considerably more potential clients. And then within those clients, who's most likely to find the most value engaging with you throughout their full research and decision-making process. And when it comes to energy efficiency in larger environments, there may actually be someone with one or both of those words in their job title. In most small to mid-sized companies, this may be someone like ESG, environmental social governance kind of person that cares a lot about sustainability. There could be a chief sustainability officer. I'm seeing in a lot of sustainability minded data center operators, especially in Europe. I'm starting to see people with not only a chief sustainability officer title, but I'm seeing the convergence of the chief marketing officer and chief sustainability officer as being joined at the hip. But again, who you're selling to will largely, how big or small their companies are, will determine how granular these personas need to be, how granular your segmentation strategy is, because as you likely know, in smaller companies, people wear lots of different hats. You have one person taking on many different roles. And if you're selling more to mid-market and enterprise companies, you'll tend to find that those roles tend to get split up over multiple people, in some cases, multiple teams. So depending on your size and your target client size, that will drive a lot of how you approach your segmentation, a lot of how you define and prioritize your buyer personas. And once you've figured out and ranked and prioritized who these buyer personas are, then we need to know in their own words what their biggest goals are and what their biggest struggles are, what their biggest challenges are when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center energy efficiency. And once we know that, we can take that research that we got back in their own words and use that to impact everything we do with our website copywriting, our product strategy, our product marketing, our sales enablement, our email marketing, our social media marketing, and perhaps most important of all, our events marketing. What we're going to do with hosting our own educational events, both virtually and in person, that move the needle on educating and building trust with your target clients about anything and everything that's top of mind to them when it comes to data center energy efficiency. And the goal is to get in early and to get in often, so that you're in early enough to be able to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options in front of them. So they're exposed to your best practices and your methodology. And they're getting so much value from attending these kind of events that they're highly motivated to bring their peers along with them when they come back for part 2 next week, next month, next quarter. So when you send the simple email back to them, hey, it's great to see that you registered for our upcoming webinar, our upcoming evening symposia, lunch and learn, whatever it is. But we know when it comes to data center energy efficiency, it takes a village. With most companies, there's typically representatives involved from sustainability, ESG, compliance, operations, finance, operations, whatever. The suggestions on who they should forward this to will vary depending on who typically sits on the decision committees based on where you've historically sold to. So when you're providing a lot of value or promising to provide a lot of value in the topic and in the title of the registration landing page, your registrants will be a lot more motivated to say like, oh yeah, they're right. Yeah, there are 2 or 3 other people from our team that should also attend. I'll hit the forward button. I'll show this on Slack, whatever. And you'll know this is starting to work because you see multiple people from the same company registering and attending. Teams that learn together, grow together. And most importantly, you're accomplishing something in the early and the middle stages of the journey that challenges a lot of account executives going forward. In the modern digital self-driven buyer's journey, a lot of being an account executive now comes down to operating more like a project manager that is helping your internal champion drive alignment among their peers, among their coworkers, among the decision-making committee, among people from other teams that also weigh in. That's a lot of what being an account executive, that's a lot of what being an enterprise AE comes down to. And when you're able to start this process and plant the seeds even earlier on in the journey, you really stack the decks in your company's favor quite dramatically, because the more people from this company that are attending your educational events, the more likely it is that you're starting to win over multiple members of the decision committee long before they're ready for a sales conversation. The more likely it is that they're open to learning all of your best practices on how other individuals in similar companies have approached data center energy efficiency. And the more they enjoy your events, the more likely it is that you start to gradually meet the entire decision committee in a way that truly stacks the decks in your favor. Not only do you stay on the short list, in many cases, when you're doing this exceptionally well, most or all of your competitors disappear from the short list because they're just learning so much from your company at a world-class level. If you have internal subject matter experts that can be the presenters, fantastic. If not, lean on your clients, lean on your channel partners, lean on other contractors and consultants that you work with, and then you move into more of a moderator host kind of role. And usually in most cases, it's a combination of the two. So if there's 10 or 12 topics you want to cover, maybe a third or a half of those topics, you have great internal subject matter experts who could put together a simple deck and talk for 30 or 40 minutes about that topic. And when you don't have it, you bring in your clients, you bring in your consultants, you moderate an interview, you moderate a panel, multi-guest kind of panel, similar that you would have at a large industry conference. And the cool part with all of this is it's very specifically focused on your ideal client profile, your target account list. You don't have this massive loss factor that usually comes from going to a conference where 2/3, 3/4 of the attendees are just not a fit for your company. When you control who's getting the invitations to come to the event, 100% of the people that are registering and 100% of the people that are attending should be in your ideal client profile, should be sitting within your target account list. So these are your leads. These are how leads get nurtured. They keep coming back. You're educating and building trust. And in many cases, it is a very, very, very natural outgrowth of that. By the third or fourth time through, they're either approaching you that they want to talk to you about a potential project, or they want to bring you in to talk at one of their offsite events or workshops where you go from meeting 3 people or 4 people from the team to meeting the entire team that's going to ultimately weigh in on this, or a little bit of both. But that's how a data center energy efficiency consultancy can generate new leads and new clients. Lead with educational resources, lead with educational events. And the better job you do at that, the more likely it is that you win over all of the stakeholders within that particular company who are going to weigh in when it comes to all of the topics, all of the leading indicators that are directly related to data center energy efficiency. So that's how I would approach how a data center energy efficiency consultancy can generate new leads and clients. So that's the final question that I'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you enjoyed this week's episode, be sure to hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources like this, be sure that you're subscribed to our data center sales and marketing newsletter. You can do so directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. You'll be notified each Sunday directly in your email inbox. I'm Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast and the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I also lead the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me a connect request. And in the invitation note, just mention that you were watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. So we're so glad that you're able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We wish you tremendous success in growing your presence, your team's role, and your company's role in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week. And we look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.